Good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm not sure when you're watching this, but welcome to the North Hills Devotionals. I hope you guys have been enjoying these. They are just amazing. I have loved listening to Dennis on Mondays and our various worship leaders on Wednesdays and our resident historian in Brian, and then Bo on Fridays. And it's been really great. So thanks for everybody. I hope you're enjoying our videos. And today on Tuesdays, we've been breaking down these various verses on fear. And so today I thought what we're going to do, we're going to dive into the book and the journal of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a Jew that lived in Babylon, and he wrote down his incredible journey and what God did in his life. And so I want you to see this because it's quite amazing. It says in Nehemiah 4, as Nehemiah has come in from Babylon, he's on a mission to rebuild his community, his tradition. He wants to build a wall around the city so that it can be protected. And if it can be protected, then it can have an economy and people can feel safe. And in that day and age, it was really difficult if you didn't have a wall, right? And so he says, after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. So he stands up, and this is Nehemiah 4:14, and there are, at this point in our story, there are armies around the city. There's people that have been kind of gradually raising the aggression level, right? These Sanballat and these other people that they don't want to see success in Jerusalem, because that means if there's success, if there's a city wall, then they can't raid and their people can't have control over the people there. And it's not something they want to see happen. But they also know that Nehemiah, like, he's there under the authority of Babylon, and so they have to play with it. But they've decided to get up, and they think they're going to get violent here in a minute, and things have escalated. And so Nehemiah stands up, and he's looking over everybody, and he's looking over the nobles and the officials and all the people, and he says these words, and he talks about fear as they're here and they're thinking about needing to defend their families and defend their way of life. And he says this to these people. He says, don't be afraid of them. And then he says, don't be afraid. Why? He says, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. You see, the opposition, even though it has escalated, even though it has gone from insults to violence, Nehemiah, he says, don't be afraid. He says, even though things seem to escalate sometimes, even though our world, like, there's things that escalate around us, there are tensions that we're all dealing with, that we all see in the news, along with the fear for our own families and our own health. He says, don't be afraid, and don't be afraid. Why? Because remember God. And he takes time here and he prays. Takes time with God, and he says, remember God. Remember that in this moment we get to fight for something that we believe in. We get to stand up, and we get to make sure we invest in our priorities. So he says, fight for your homes, your families, your sons and your daughters. Get your priorities straight. And then he stations people, interestingly in the story, he stations people at the gaps in the walls that are nearest their neighborhood. So he says, fight for your neighborhood. Fight for your neighborhood. Your families are back. Their backs are against the wall. Fight for your families. Fight for your neighbors. Because, like, nothing is more fierce than a fighting parent, right? Like, nothing's more fierce than a parent that needs to defend their children, and he knows this. And so they're fighting here. And in these moments, he says, don't be afraid. Remember that throughout history, God has been with us. Throughout history, God has defended us. What's your history with God? If you remember the Lord this morning, how will you remember what God has done for you? If you're going to take some time today and you're going to fight for your family, maybe you live alone, and maybe fighting for your family means you need to make a phone call and let somebody know that you care, that they're not alone. Maybe you've got kids running around everywhere, and fighting for your family is just going to take a moment of breathing, and you're just like, okay, this is week. I've lost track of COVID, and I just need to take a moment. But there's no reason to be afraid, because God is right there in that with you. And Nehemiah says, you can fight for your family. You can fight for your priorities. You can take this out and use this crisis as an opportunity to arrange your priorities again and to lean into the things that matter the most. And just because we struggle doesn't mean God isn't present, right? Just because we have difficulty doesn't mean that God isn't right there going through it with us. Sometimes it's his way of allowing us to work out some things, to get our priorities around. And sometimes it's a way that we're not going to even know why we went through something until much, much later. And so how has God been with you through your previous struggles? Can you remember God's work today? And can you use that by remembering? The Bible talks about remembering a lot. It's one of the first words you'll learn if you ever take like a class in Hebrew. I remember in seminary, it was literally the first word we learned was remember. That's how often it's used. And he says, remember the Lord. So if you remember the Lord this morning, can you remember God's work? And can you use that to tap into it, to whatever it is you're facing, whatever it is you're about to walk into today or tomorrow, if you're watching this at night, or whatever it is, can you use this to walk into your next moments and say, I can go into this remembering that God is with me? So here's my challenge for you this morning. I want you to take this challenge. I want you to write down 3 times that God has been with you. 3 times that God has been with you in the past, and write them down. There's something about writing that helps. Write down 3 times that God has been with you so that you can go into today remembering those 3 times. Remember. What do you remember when you look back about the ways God has been with you? Write those 3 things down. Pray over them. Thank God for those moments. And then fight for the priorities of God and your family. Fight for those priorities of loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Fight for those priorities, because even though life is kind of crazy, we can move forward because we know that God has been with us and will continue to be with us. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much for being with us, for guiding, for being there right beside us through the incredible party times and through the incredibly sad, devastating moments. Be with us today. May we remember your presence. Amen.